Welcome to this edition of Opinion Central. I'm John Diaz, the editorial page editor here at the San Francisco Chronicle. With me is John Cox, Republican businessman and candidate for governor of California. Welcome, John.
Thank you, John. Great to be with you.
Appreciate you coming. Also with me is Josh Kolke, editorial writer. John Cox was just visiting with our editorial board. We went over a number of issues, and one of the issues that came up in a very high-profile way was housing. Mm-hmm. Now, you're in the housing business, and you have a plan to greatly accelerate the construction of housing in California. How would that work?
Well, yeah, I am in the housing business. I manage apartments and I build apartments, and I just built 28 units at a property I have in Columbus, Indiana, and we built them for about $80,000 a unit, not counting the land. But I talk to builders all over California who tell me that the costs of regulation, the cost of environmental remediations, the tremendous number of agencies that require approvals drives up the administrative costs. So it's $150,000 to $300,000 before they can even build. So clearly the land cost is different in California than in Indiana, but it's also the price of regulation. So my mission is going to be to try to reduce that price of regulation, streamline the approval process. I've talked to a lot of builders who tell me it takes 4 to 6 to 8 years to get something approved. You might miss the market by then. And of course, builders will just decide to go build elsewhere. They'll build in Texas or Arizona or someplace where they can get it done faster.
There are some going proposals to attack some of the local regulations that have been really important in preventing housing construction here. But you were telling us that you're not a big fan of that idea, and you think you can persuade local officials to allow more building instead.
Yeah. You're talking about Scott Wiener's work that he's doing. And
that's one.
And he's attacking the right problem, but I mean, I don't believe in state-forced solutions to a lot of these things. I believe in local input on housing and where housing should be and where density should be. But as the governor of this state, I hope to be able to bring together local communities and maybe make regional efforts with cities and bring in, suburban areas. And there should be, comprehensive plans done, but they should be done as more locally oriented as possible. I think the problem with Mr. Wiener's proposal is the state having such a oversized involvement in it.
You mentioned cutting regulations, streamlining the process. Specifically, what would you go after?
Well, I think it's the number of agencies that are involved in approving these housing projects. And again, we need to make sure that there's local input, but we can provide incentives. And I'm a Jack Kemp Republican. I mentioned that, and Jack was interested in having government be a catalytic factor, but in a way to incentivize activity. We talked about enterprise zones, and that's one of the things Jack talked about is having areas of cities that were lagging behind in terms of economic development, have those areas have, regulation holidays and low tax areas where they would encourage investment. I could see as the governor leading an effort to make those kinds of things, giving incentives to people to invest in communities as opposed to using the heavy hand of government down and forcing, certain development.
One of the areas that's been a matter of focus in the legislature the last few years, but has not gone anywhere, is in reforming the California Environmental Quality Act.
Yes, that's a big issue.
In order to facilitate development. Now, Governor Jerry Brown, who has a Democratic legislature, called it the Lord's work to reform it, but he hasn't been able to do it. What kind of reforms would you like to see, and what do you think you could accomplish that a Democratic governor could not accomplish with a Democratic legislature?
Well, that's going to be tough, but I'll work to do it. I'll obviously use the powers of my office. I'll use the ballot initiative process if I have to, but CEQA has got to be amended. And right now, it's being used by labor unions to sue developers to get better work deals. It's being used by some developers to keep out competitive developments. It's used by some businesses to keep businesses from operating in the state. It's become such a web of litigation, and it's vastly increased the cost of doing business in the state. I believe in clean air. I believe in clean water. I certainly applaud President Reagan, remember, signed that piece of legislation. And he did it back in 1970 when you couldn't see buildings in Los Angeles because of the smog. But thankfully, we've cleaned up the air to a large extent. We can't rest. We need to continue to, watch and be diligent. But we also can now, I think, modify it to some degree, make it less advantageous to file strike suits and other things like that.
On another subject, you've gotten a lot of attention for a plan that would dramatically increase the size of the legislature, somewhat counterintuitively for a Republican. Is that something you're still pushing?
Well, I believe it's important to get rid of special interest corruption in Sacramento. I mean, the influence of all these funders, and it's big business as well as big labor that does this. So they're trying to keep the status quo, and they're using their money to do it. The reform that I proposed is one of many that we could look at. I'm not married to one in particular. I happen to think that one is decent, not because of the number of legislators, Josh. It's all about the size of the districts and the size of the campaigns. We got to get the influence of money out of our political system. I'm dead set on that. I want to bring people back into the system. The people should be encouraged. I worry about the low turnout levels. Recently in Los Angeles, the turnouts were less than 10% in some assembly races. I think that's dangerous for our democracy. You talk to most people, they think that politicians just answer to the big funders. And I think that's dangerous. We got to make sure that people feel that the political system is responsive to them. And I'm going to continue to talk about reforms when I'm governor of the state.
You've talked about a 12,000 member legislature, people voting from home on their laptops. How does that necessarily make the system less corruptible or susceptible to special interests than it is now?
Well, again, it's not the biggest issue I'm talking about in the race. I'm running to get to be the manager of this state, to turn the state around, make it affordable, make it open for business, reduce regulations, build the California Water Project, get the price of gasoline lower through getting rid of the gas tax. Those are the prime issues I'm talking about, John. At the right times, after I'm governor, I'm certainly going to be talking about ways to reform the system that's going to allow people to dictate what happens in the state and not the special interests.
Immigration is obviously a huge issue in this state, and particularly the recent back and forth over the status of the Dreamers, the young immigrants brought here illegally as children. You were telling us that you think the problem there is not really the president revoking the protected status they had, but you think that Democrats are perpetuating this problem.
Well, listen, President Obama put in the idea by executive order, which was wrong. It should have been a congressional solution. President Trump, I think, did the right thing and said, well, the executive order should not have been the way to do it. Congress should act. I absolutely believe Congress should act. And I think the president's done a great thing putting an offer on the table for DACA. And the Democrats, they didn't want to negotiate. They didn't want to solve the problem. I really believe they like the fact that the system is broken and they can use it as a political tool. I'm a businessman just like the president. I want to solve problems. I want to do it in collaboration as much as I can. But we've got a broken immigration system. We've got this ridiculous sanctuary state law that I think is contrary to the rule of law. I think it sends the wrong message that somehow we're not going to protect law-abiding citizens. We're going to favor illegal alien criminals. I think that's wrong. I think the government should be protecting us. I think that's the first role of government, to do that. And Jerry Brown and Gavin Newsom are typical politicians. They jawbone and they create fear and anger. And I'm going to try to be a leader in terms of solving the problems and fixing a broken system.
A lot of Democratic leaders in the state, including Attorney General Javier Becerra and Governor Brown, essentially think that President Trump has all but declared war on California. They mention things like the tax bill, which ends some deductions that are very important to California, lowers the property tax, the mortgage deduction, state and local income tax, go back clean air rules, the immigration raids, undermining covered California. Just the list goes on and on. Is there anything that President Trump has done with impact on California that you disagree with?
You know, the Democrats like to blame the president, and why? Because when you're trying to distract people from the mess they've made. This state is number 50 out of 50 in quality of life. It has the worst business environment in the country. People can't afford their houses. They can't afford their gasoline. They move farther and farther away from work, and then the legislature hits them with a gas tax, and they blame President Trump. I think it's a good thing that they wiped out the tax deductibility of state income tax. It's costing me money. But I think the people of the state ought to be focusing on how much tax they have to pay, because this state legislature and this government keeps taxing them and taxing them and taxing them to death. They ought to focus on that more importantly. We need to get some of these problems fixed, and they want to blame President Trump for everything. My answer is solve the problems.
But just back to the question, is there anything that the Trump administration has done with impact on California that you disagree with?
Well, I like the tax cut because it brings trillions of dollars back for our businesses. I think it's going to help economic growth. I like cutting regulations. I think forcing an issue on border security is very important because we need to have border security. So the answer to your question is, I may not agree with the president on some of the ways he does things, but I certainly do agree with him on the policies that he's pursuing.
So policy-wise, in terms of policy impact on California, there's nothing you take issue with?
Well, I like the tax cuts because they're repatriating trillions to the economy. I think that helps a lot of California businesses. I think reducing regulations, I think, also helps a lot of California companies. Meanwhile, the state legislature here is keeping, regulations in the state level and driving businesses away. So I wish the state legislature would pay attention to some of the things that President Trump is doing in terms of cutting taxes and cutting regulations.
You're originally from Chicago. You're quite a bit newer to California than a lot of the leading candidates, all the leading candidates in this race. Is that something voters should take into account?
My family has been in California since 1968. My grandparents moved out here to Mountain View in 1968. My aunt taught at Stanford. I had another aunt that lived in the Bay Area and in Southern California her whole life. My mom retired here in 1980. I have a whole ton of family in this state. I don't think that it's that big of an issue to people. I mean, most people in California, frankly, weren't born here. I mean, this state has a whole bunch of people who emigrated from other countries as well as other parts of the country. So I think people will be able to identify with me in that regard.
John, just one quick final question. I'm trying to read your green wristband. What causes
well, that's the
that?
Neighborhood legislature. that's the idea that I have.
The
I wear it because it's the small district legislature. I do it because then people ask me about it, and we get a conversation going. I have to have a lot of conversations about reforming the system. That's what I'm all about, by the way, is reforming the system. And I think that's what the people of this state want. They want true reform. They're not interested in continuing the same high-cost, poor quality of life that we have in the state of California.
John Cox, Republican candidate for governor, thank you so much. I will look forward to seeing you down in San Jose on May 8th for the gubernatorial debate. I also want to thank my colleague Josh Kolke and our executive producer, Brittany Schell. And with that, this edition of Opinion Central is over. I'm John Diaz, Chronicle editorial page editor. Thank you for joining us.